and so on and so on. It is true that now, and defining now is a bit tricky, but now we are moving from the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius. Because remember, the signs go backwards because the top wobbles backwards. The big question, though, is when does the age of Aquarius begin? Did it begin in the 60s? Does it begin on 2012? Did it begin with the French and American revolutions a couple hundred years ago? Remember, we're talking about a 2,000-year cycle, a 26,000-year cycle, where it's in each sign for 2,000 years. And so the transition is not in a moment. It happens in waves and waves and waves again and again and again. And it's apparent that now we are at another crest of this wave in this transition from the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius. It seems that when these outer planets meet in conjunction, square, opposition, or square again, or conjunction again, again and again and again and again, when these outer planets meet like this, every time they do, there's a corresponding change of consciousness here on Earth. Something happens where the individual egos kind of pop, explode, jump out of their ego-ness. Almost like, if you can think of evolutionarily, we had fish in the ocean, and then we had mammals on the land. How did that happen? Well, I don't know if it really happened this way or not, but think of being a fish millions of years ago, before there were any mammals. And then under one of these outer planet transits where there's this idea that there's something else beyond what I am as a fish, you jump up out of the water and you're above the water and you go, because you can't breathe up there. But you look around and you go, holy smokes, there's a whole universe up here that's not water. And then you go back down into water. Well, every time there's an outer planet alignment, these conjunction squares and oppositions, we're like fish. The human race is like fish that gets glimpses of something greater. We saw it in the 60s. We saw it in the late 80s, early 90s. And we're seeing it again now, where it's not good enough to just go about our daily job, our daily work, our regular roles. Something happens where we begin to see that there's a larger thing, a larger picture. Something happens where the switch goes click, and it's no longer about who I am. It's about what is all this? And it drives us to then want to make corresponding changes. But unfortunately, these outer planetary shifts are not all fun and games, because transitions often have a darker side. There's often pain associated with any change where we have to leave something behind, and often these changes are so great, so grand, that we don't know how to incorporate the energy. In the 1960s, during the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, we saw a movement that was part of a wider movement that we can call back to nature. There was the sense of the rise of communes, of self-reliance, of wanting to be closer to nature, and to some extent it was the first wave in modern times of what has been called a re-enchantment of the world, of the universe, because from the age of enlightenment, which Rob Hand has called the age of darkenment, since the age of enlightenment, using science and technology, we've separated ourselves from the outer world, from the cosmos. And one of the things that came from the 1960s was the rediscovery or the reawakening of the fact that we were not separate from the outer world, that it was as alive as we are. One of the things that began to happen during the 60s, or as a result of that consciousness, was something that now we take for granted, or at least many people do, and that's the idea of recycling. The reason why this is so important is that it is a shift away from a concept of an economic model that simply cannot be sustained any longer. The British economist Thomas Malthus was responsible largely for coming up with the idea that there was a limitation to resources, to food, and that as human population increased, that the resources would become more limited, and therefore there wouldn't be enough for you and me. Therefore, I needed to make decisions so that there would be enough for me. And whether we are aware of this or not, this Malthusian economic model has driven the British Empire and the American Empire, and to some extent, it was this very assumption of our economic model that was called into question during the Uranus-Pluto conjunction of the 1960s, and then again during the Saturn-Uranus-Neptune conjunction of the late 80s, early 90s. In fact, one of the biggest switches in this idea of the limited environment was the crash of the Exxon Valdez in Alaska, which at that time seemed remotely far away. And yet, in one event, and interestingly enough, this event happened within 12 hours of an exact alignment of Saturn, the planet of limitation, Saturn, the planet of rock, Saturn, the planet of you get what you deserve. Saturn aligned with Neptune, the planet that astrologically is symbolic of oil, symbolically of alcohol, symbolic of alcohol. Neptune, which is symbolic of the high seas, of the oceans. And so what we had is within 12 hours of an exact alignment that happens every few decades. We had Saturn aligning with Neptune, and all of a sudden we realized that our use of oil created its own reality when it hit the rocks on the high seas, when someone was drinking alcohol, and all of a sudden we all knew that there was a limitation. Now, these kinds of events happen again and again where something fulfills the imagery from Earth's point of view. But the important thing here is that we are now moving from the 60s through the early 90s, now into this 2012 period of time where we haven't gotten it right yet. And the intensity of the game has gone up a notch because we're either going to figure it out or we're not, and we may not get another shot at it.